Hello to you all in Australia. I'm speaking to you from sunny Scotland, where the day length here is fast diminishing as we approach Christmas. I'm sorry I can't be with you all at the conference. One, because it would be great to see you, but two, I'd love to experience some heat and more sunshine right now. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak to you all online, and I wanted to start by telling you a little bit about me. I'm Jamie McIntosh and I'm working for Highline International as a Global Technical Services Manager and cage free specialist. I've been in the poultry industry for roughly 18 years and I've been fortunate enough to get a good grounding in this industry through my previous roles. Firstly, as a farm manager for one of the largest egg packers in the UK, where I was responsible for approximately 350,000 layers in cage-free systems, and latterly a sales and technical role in the UK gave me really good experience of different types of cage-free setup and different types of challenges across many different systems and businesses throughout the UK. And now, as I approach a year in my global role with Highline International, I'm rapidly building a picture of cage free around the world. And that's how I'm going to start today's session, looking into a bit of the history and then a snapshot of what's happening in cage free around the world. I'll then cover a section on how equipment design relates and impacts to cage free management, and finally a few slides on the two most critical phases for successful cage free performance. A good place to begin when we're talking about cage free is to look at where it all started. And back in the mid 1960s, an activist by the name of Ruth Harrison published this book, Animal Machines, that you can see on the left hand side of the screen. This had a profound impact at the time with the general public in the UK, and as a result it went all the way to government level because she highlighted what she perceived to be poor animal welfare outcomes from birds kept in cages along with other types of intensively kept animals. And as a result, the government in 1965 commissioned the Bramble Report, which was tasked with coming up with new ideas of how to improve animal welfare. And the main finding of that report were the five freedoms, which are still widely used today. And you can see them here in the middle of the screen. We've got freedom from hunger and thirst, from discomfort, from pain, injury and disease, freedom to express normal behaviour, and freedom from fear and distress. And more recently, this has evolved into the four domains of animal welfare, which looks beyond trying to prevent poor environmental conditions, takes it a step further by promoting good animal welfare practices. And if we look at this second bottom freedom, freedom to express normal behaviour, well, that's very difficult to achieve in an enriched cage environment, never mind a cage environment. And I think this was a real catalyst to the gradual shift that we saw away from the conventional cage and into enriched cages and cage free, beginning with Switzerland banning the conventional cage back in the early 90s to a complete Europe-wide ban of cages in 2012. And we're already seeing big shifts elsewhere around different parts of the world. So where are we in these different parts of the world with cage free? Well, if we look to the top left hand side of the screen, we can see in Europe that we're already around 60% cage free, and that figure will increase again as we see Eastern European countries and Southern European countries transition further away from enriched cages. In the US, we can see in the bottom left hand side of the screen how development in cage free has really taken off in the last 10 years. We've seen a huge shift from less than 10% 10 years ago to around 40% today. And again, that figure is projected to increase further in the next few years due to retailer demand. In South America, on the bottom right hand side of the screen, we can see several countries are establishing cage-free niche markets, except for Colombia, which has seen a much bigger shift and now represents at least 30 to 40% of the whole market. Elsewhere, in Australia and New Zealand, as we know, we've seen a big shift away from cage production, and that has happened very quickly. And in Asia, there is more and more interest in developing niche markets for cage-free. And from a production point of view, we've always got to remember that producers shifting from cage to cage-free have very little knowledge of how to manage this. And this is an area which is very important for a breeding company like ours at Highline to offer that support to make sure that our customers continue to get to reach potential of our genetics. Moving on to equipment design. When we talk about equipment design, whether it be for rearing or laying, it covers everything from these more basic floor systems on the left-hand side of the screen to these multi-level rearing and laying systems on the right hand of the screen. And there are various interpretations of how these systems can look, and the types of systems that we can see out there are vast. And I've put some examples here on the screen of just how they might look. And when we talk about equipment design, we have to remember that it really matters. And I think there are two main areas of focus here. And if we look to the left-hand side of the screen, we can view equipment design from the owner or stockman's eyes. It can have an impact on bird welfare. Better design is going to allow stocks people to better observe, access and handle the birds. And on productivity, equipment design that supports natural behaviours is going to reduce stress that can lead to feather pecking, smothering and floor eggs, which are all challenges that the stocks person needs to manage. And on labour efficiency, we need to consider the time it takes to carry out these routine tasks, like floor egg collection, for example, and also the physical strain endured from these personnel walking around the floor areas and the systems in the hen house. And if we look at the right-hand side of the screen, we can look at how equipment design impacts the bird. How do I access feed and water? Have I been trained in how to find feed and water and rear? And do I feel comfortable and confident accessing this feed and water? Where am I resting? And in this picture on the right hand side, we can see different examples of how a bird can express their normal behaviours. And this relates back to the 5 freedoms I was talking about. This is the whole concept behind free range, is allowing these birds to express their normal behaviours. And from our point of view, we're concerned with perching primarily, perching for birds to sleep and also to rest. And how equipment for perching is designed that way is very important. And finally, is this a safe place to lay my egg? Firstly, do I know where the nest box is in the first place? And secondly, do I feel comfortable spending time in there to lay my egg? And the better that we are at addressing all of these concerns, the more likely we are to see our birds reach their full genetic potential. So what kind of systems are we going to see out there? Well, I can split into 3 areas for both rear and lay. For rearing, first of all, in its most basic form, we have floor rearing on the left hand side, where you will see little to no equipment at all. In the middle we have a jump start system, which is a hybrid, if you like, between a floor and an aviary system. And in a jump start we'll see retrofitted equipment like tables and perches put into a shed to increase the stocking density of that shed and to allow birds to access different levels to train them for aviary systems or multi-level systems. We also strategically place nipple lines and feed tracks to entice the birds up onto these levels. Now the big difference here between a jump start and an aviary is that on a jump start system we place our day-old chicks on the floor. In an aviary system, however, like we see examples of on the right hand side, we place these chicks in the system. So from day one, these chicks know that this is their safe place to rest, to eat and to drink. And that will later transpire into a place that the birds are more comfortable to lay in as well. And then if we look at different types of laying systems, we can split them into three different areas again. We have floor laying in its most basic form, and in the previous slide I showed what floor rearing systems might look like, and a floor rearing system is going to be perfectly acceptable for a laying system like this. One point I will raise here about this floor laying system is all these birds are on the floor. One way to improve this from a welfare point of view is to put in perching or tables if the system allows, because any opportunity that we can give birds to access different levels will help take the pressure off the floor and make birds more comfortable and promote a reduction in unwanted pecking behaviours. In the middle we have a combi system, also known as a convertible. Quite simply, it's a cage system with the doors open for birds to access the floor areas. That can work really well for some markets that are looking to maximise stocking density and also alternate between cage and cage-free production depending on market demands for the different types of eggs. From a management point of view, this type of system is very challenging, and as you can see, you quite often have these narrow aisle widths like we see in this picture. So making navigation through this for the personnel is very difficult, and for the birds to have the space to move around being so limited can lead to problems. And following that, having birds distribute themselves evenly throughout the different cages when they're back in the system can be very challenging indeed. And on the right hand side we have different types of aviary setup. On the top right hand side we can see a fairly popular design out there where you have the equipment shaped like a pyramid or a Christmas tree, so that birds accessing different levels can do so more easily than a vertically placed system. So from a welfare point of view, it can make sense. And on the bottom right hand side of the screen we can see a different setup where you have the floor area and you have a level below the nest boxes with feed and water, another level above the nest boxes with feed only, because if we had water up there we wouldn't attract birds down to lay eggs in the nest, which is in the middle. And this type of system can work well in terms of labour efficiency. It's quite an easy system to navigate and relatively easy for management purposes with carrying out the routine tasks like checking for fallen stock or picking up system eggs. So what do we want to see in cage-free setups in terms of best practice? We want to see as close a match as possible between our rearing and laying environments. Mismatches are more likely to create problems. So the closer a match we can get between rearing and laying systems in terms of the perching, the flooring, the feeding system, the water system, lighting, the more easy the transition is going to be for the bird. And if we don't get that close match and we see mismatches in their more extreme examples, like for example birds being reared on a floor reared system like I showed you, going to an aviary system like I showed you in the next page, this is going to create a real challenge for training the birds in the laying house to come off the floor and onto the system. And it can take weeks and weeks for most of those birds to go up, and there's never a guarantee that they will all find their way back up onto the system if they're reared in the wrong way. We want easy access for feed and water. Stocking density is key here. If we have a shed that's overstocked, or a particular area of a shed overstocked, it's going to make it more challenging for birds to find their way to the feed and water, and of course the nest box. So to avoid these problems, we want to encourage the use of vertical space, especially in rear. So if the birds are trained to confidently move amongst in between the different levels in rear, this is going to create far less of an issue with access to feed and water. Perch and ramp placement is important here too. The more strategically these ramps and perches are placed, the more help we provide the birds in moving around. And I've already mentioned this, but space and stocking density are key here. Local regulation is going to dictate in a lot of different parts of the world how many birds you're allowed to house in a shed. And we've got to be realistic. We need to make the production economically viable. But the message here is that the less that we overstock, the more likely we are to improve bird movement, bird confidence, and therefore performance. And then we also have to think about other areas like lighting, for example. We need a nice even spread across the house, and we don't want any flickering in the lights. That's also something to avoid. In terms of ventilation, this can be more challenging, especially in houses with aviary equipment, because we're putting in big barriers to that natural airflow. So that has to be considered as well. And with aviaries, we have to think a bit more about cleaning as well. So we want to be planning a lot longer for turnaround if we are coming into aviary production without any knowledge. So looking at rearing now, whichever equipment we use, the goal here is always to create an environment where a day-old chick can develop into a robust, well-adapted point-of-lay pullet. And to achieve this, we want to see birds hit their body weight targets with good physiological development, beginning with the digestive tract and immune system, which are going to develop in those first few weeks. So how do we make that happen? Quite simply by getting the basics right. And this is the first of two critical phases that we have for successful cage-free performance. And for the Highline Next Gen, providing the right environment, like it is for any bird, is very important. And in terms of environment, when we place these chicks, we need to make sure that we're doing this at the right temperature. We're looking for 34 to 35 degrees at chick height, with good humidity of 60 to 70%, and we want to avoid drafts. So if we look for a second at this picture in the middle, we see this inlet directly feeding onto chicks. We have to be very careful that we don't have cold air from a source like this dumping straight onto the chicks, because these chicks at this age can't thermoregulate. They can lose heat very quickly through their feet. We need to make sure primarily before feed that birds can find and can access the water. We need that water to be free of any airlocks and free of any pathogens. So temperature is critical. We don't want the water too cold, which is going to make it more uncomfortable for the chicks to drink from, especially if they've been beak treated. And if the water is too long and has been sitting there for too long, it risks being stagnant and harboring harmful bacteria, which we also want to avoid. Feeding at this early stage, We want a chick crumb that is easily accessible to the birds. What do I mean by that? Well, we want our feed systems flooded, and we also want a nice even spread of feed across paper throughout the shed, or if in an aviary rearing setup, paper beside our feed track. And we don't want this heaped, and we want it replaced as often as is necessary. And believe it or not, at this early stage, we should be thinking about how we train birds to move. And you can see in these pictures, at just a few days old, we have chicks already accessing the feed track in this top right hand picture. And also in this middle picture, we have some chicks at less than a week old already accessing a perch above the feed track. And above all, at this early stage, this brooding phase, we need to monitor. We need to monitor water to make sure the flow is there, to make sure we're checking whether the chicks are drinking in the first place and drinking enough. We can monitor feed intake. And one of the best things we can do is monitor crop fill. And I put this picture in here to show just how we can do that. It's very simple but very effective for us to gauge whether that feed is being taken in by chicks. And above all, we need to take a holistic approach, and checking our environment on a regular basis is going to help us do that. And one of the best ways we can monitor is by using our senses. For example, if we come into a shed and we see chicks that are either huddled, which means they're going to be too cold, or spread out to the outer edges of the system environment or floor that they're in, it means they're likely to be too hot. And we have to react accordingly. And one quick point to mention on lighting. I highly recommend use of an intermittent lighting program. It's well proven to encourage chick activity. 4 hours of light followed by 2 hours of darkness for a 24-hour period for a week or even longer can work really well, because every time those lights come on, the more active chicks are going to help stimulate the less active chicks to start pecking away at that feed. The second critical phase for flock success, in my eyes, is the transfer period. As mentioned previously, the rearing system should closely resemble the laying house. We want to avoid mismatches. For example, floor-reared birds going onto a multi-level aviary, because that is going to lead to poor adaptation. And the goal here is that we have pullets that have been very well trained to move confidently and navigate levels. And the key considerations before transfer is to ensure that the target body weight, breed body weight, has been achieved. Good uniformity, ideally above 85%, with a vaccination program completed with as little stress as possible. And that's what this phase is really focused on, is minimizing the stress before transfer and during it as well. The ideal transfer age is around 16 weeks. There's a little bit of flexibility there, but we want to avoid early transfer where birds are underdeveloped and don't have the confidence or know how to navigate the new systems. And we also want to avoid being too late, where we're more likely to delay the onset of lay and potentially cause more issues with floor and system eggs too. When those birds are transferred, the most important area that we need to look at is water. A bird can lose up to around 10% of her body weight during transfer, and most of that is through dehydration. So we need to make sure these birds are finding the water and drinking the water as quickly as possible. And then the next thing to focus on is feed. And going back to what I said about stocking density in different areas of the house, in this top right hand picture, we can see a popular system where we have two levels. What I see time and time again are too many birds placed in one part, and as a result, the feeding system is more heavily utilized in this area, and it can be quite easy to miss the feed tracks running empty. So that is something to be aware of. In terms of navigation, we want to help these birds continue to adapt to the new system, finding the drinking system, the feeding system, and of course the different levels of the house and the nest boxes too. And to do that, we're going to usually walk the sheds to encourage them to do that. And that is much more important to consider with brown varieties. White varieties are likely to adapt much quicker. And in terms of space, as I mentioned, we want to avoid overcrowding. We want to give birds room to explore, so having that distribution as uniform as possible is going to help. Lighting. One golden rule is we never want to reduce the day length at this time. In closed side houses, we want to stimulate on body weight. In open side houses, we need to consider how we create as much of a stimulation as possible. So it's very important to plan early on how we're going to do this and align with the different times of year to make that happen effectively. In terms of ventilation and temperature, we want to maintain fresh air with a stable and comfortable environment. We want a nice airflow with good airspeed going through the house, but not direct drafts in areas, for example, like the nest boxes, which might make that environment uncomfortable for the birds. Initially, we want to keep those nest boxes closed for the first day or two anyway, so that we make sure these birds are focusing on feed and water initially. And then finally, we need to ensure that we make sure all birds are getting back onto the system at night. And if birds have been reared on aviaries and have been trained well to access different levels, it's not going to take too long. Just a few days to get from this situation to this situation on the bottom right. But if we have poorly trained birds that don't know how to access the system as well, it can take a lot longer. And in worst case scenario, you may find that a proportion of the birds never make it up onto the system. So it's definitely something to keep in mind. And then following transfer, once the birds have settled in, we have a period of 4, 6, maybe 8 weeks where it is absolutely crucial that personnel, stocks people are putting in maximum effort, and that effort will lead to a much easier flock to manage for the duration of the flock. And when I say monitoring, I'm talking about water consumption and feed consumption. We need to track this on a regular basis, at least daily, to make sure these birds are gaining weight for egg production as we need. And if they aren't, we can act very quickly when we know the figures. If we don't, it can delay this process. We want to keep familiarizing the pullets with the intricacies of the system that they're in, different system levels, perching, nest boxes. We want to give them encouragement to access this as well as finding feed, water, and the nest boxes. In terms of feed system management, we need to allow and plan for constant changes as the bird increases her capacity over time, and that can take a lot of planning, so we need to be ready for that. And nest box training. After that initial phase where we close the nest boxes. As soon as is practically possible, and at least before the first egg is seen, we need to open those nest boxes, at least in the morning period, to give these birds every opportunity to explore and become comfortable in that nest box environment. And the earlier that we make that happen, the less likely we are to see crowding in certain nest boxes as well. So just to summarize what I've talked about today to you all, I've given an overview of cage-free around the world. It's progressing fast in many parts, and it's something as a company, Highline International, are watching very closely and are ready to provide support for when the time happens in the different areas of the world, and we will continue to work very hard on that. I then talked about equipment design and the impact on bird management, and then following on from that, talked about the key areas for success in cage-free performance, which were the brooding phase in rear and then the transfer phase in those first few weeks of the laying period, to ensure that we promote this genetic potential that we know we have in these birds. And by getting the management right and the nutrition right and the biosecurity right, we know that there is a fantastic opportunity for our birds to reach their full genetic potential. Thank you very much, everybody.